So this is what our quote sandwich looks like. We have 3 steps in which if we follow through correctly, we should be able to embed a quote into any response, whether that's for a paragraph, in an essay, or for a short answer or extended response question. For right now, we're going to pretend that we are only answering short answer / extended response type questions. When the time comes to do our first essay, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So our quote sandwich has 3 components. The very first thing that we need to do, unofficially, we would need to choose or narrow down what quote is most important, what quote to try to include into our story or into our answer. But officially, step 1 of the quote sandwich is to introduce the quote. And to introduce the quote, you could do it a few different ways. Typically, with informational texts, we will use a signal phrase and a reporting verb. You could use this with literary, what's the word? With other types of literature that is not informational, so such as in a literary analysis, if I was asking you about different characters and things, you could use the character's name and the reporting verb. However, when in doubt, the easiest thing that I find is for some people to just introduce what's going on in a scene and who's talking, who's saying the quote. That seems to be an easy solution for the blend part as well. And I'll show you how to do this in just a second. Keep in mind, folks, that you want to pretend as though the person who's going to be reading your responses, who's going to read your essays, has no idea what is going on in the story. When we get to your essays, I am literally going to pretend I have no idea what you're talking about when you're talking about a specific story. So make sure that you introduce what's going on very well, very clearly. Step 2 is to add in your quote. Make sure that you're using your quotation marks. Make sure that you are citing your sources. And step 3 is to explain the quote in the commentary. It is of vital importance that you explain your quote. A lot of people I've noticed over the last few weeks either don't blend their quote, they forget to add a quote altogether, or they will forget to cite. And then there's some of us who don't even bother explaining how the quote is relevant to their answer at all. And this is actually a very, very critical component. Just as an FYI, you might think that doing all this is a lot of work, and you're right, maybe at this point for you, it is a lot of work. But when we get to essay writing, you're going to be trying to do 2 quote sandwiches per body paragraph. Our very first essay, I'll let you know, is probably just going to have 1 quote sandwich. But even 1 quote sandwich can have anywhere from 3 to 4 to 5 sentences. At the bottom of our handout right here, we have some sample signal phrases as well as some reporting verbs. So I'm giving you a list of reporting verbs because it gets really repetitive and annoying when someone uses says a lot. So you want to stay away from the cliched verbs. You could use something like so-and-so believes, so-and-so implies, so-and-so writes or argues or claims. These are much better words than using the same old, the author says, blah, 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 blah. For the signal phrases, the majority of these are going to work best with an informational text, such as in the opinion of Dr. Durham, and then you would insert your quote. If it makes sense, if it fits well. You could also use a signal phrase in combination with a reporting verb, as you can see right here in this option. For example, Dr. Durham acknowledges, and then you would insert your quote. You could use the same procedure with a literary analysis of something. So say we were reading a story about this guy named George Zaniam. That name should sound very familiar to you. We just read the interlopers. So if we were saying that George said something, we would put George's name here. George argues, or George believes, George denies, and then we would insert our quote. So that's like the basics of the quote sandwich. It's going to make a lot more sense the more times you practice this. And we do have a practice worksheet that we're going to be working on today that's on Google Classroom. So I'll show that to you towards the end. First thing I want to do is give you some tips on embedding and blending your quotes. And if you want to jot this down either on the back of this handout or in your notes for my virtual kiddos, definitely go ahead and pause the video whenever you need to include these tips in your notes section. So here's some tips on blending and embedding your quotes. When we are working with a reporting verb, remember a reporting verb is this thing right here. There's going to be a comma that goes between the reporting verb and the quote. For example, George admits no one living can remember seeing a Znaim and a von Gradwitz talking to one another in friendship. Notice my citation is done correctly in MLA. That means there's no period here. Period goes on the outside of my citation. In the citation, I should have the author's last name and the page number on which I found the quote. So this tip has to do with this comma right here. George is my character. Admits is my reporting verb. You can see this right here up at the top of our screen as well. I used this technique to blend my quote. And because I have a reporting verb and then the quote, I need to have a comma here. The comma indicates that this is going to be a piece of evidence from the text. Tip number 2, when you are using a reporting verb followed by the word that, you are not going to use a comma. Do not use a comma. I'm using the same scenario from the first tip over in the second one. So George admits that no one living can remember seeing a Znaim and a von Gradwitz talking to one another in friendship. The sentence still makes sense, but because we added the word that, we do not need the comma. Over here, we're using a comma because it is one of our comma rules. You should have this written down in your mugs. If for some reason you don't, you might want to revisit your comma mugs and write those rules down. All right, next tip, always write in present tense. Do not go into the past tense. All literary analyses are supposed to be written in present tense. When you switch to past tense, it weakens what you're trying to say. George admits that no one living can remember seeing a Znaim and a von Gradwitz talking to one another in friendship. Instead of admitted, we use the present tense version. Next tip, when adding or altering, meaning changing words in a quote, make sure that you use brackets to indicate the change. And brackets are these square brackets that I'm talking about. Don't use parentheses. Don't use the bracket parenthesis love child either. I don't even know what those are used for. So we're going to stick with our square parentheses, these guys. And notice this is the same quote from the first few tips. This time I have changed some of the words or altered them. George admits that no one living can remember seeing the two of them talking to one another in friendship. Sentence still makes sense. The brackets indicate to us that these are not actual words in the text. They have been changed. My citation is still there, period is still on the outside. Looks good. Next tip. When you use ellipses, so ellipses are those dots, you use those to skip words in a quote. Whatever quote you're left with must still make sense. Do not start your quote with ... Do not end your quote with ... For example, over here, The von Gradwitz and Znaim families are still in the midst of a feud because, and I jump straight into the quote, there is no need to do ... Whether or not our sentence starts here does not matter. The fact that we're blending it implies that. So no need for ... here. Similarly, no ... at the end. Do not do it. The only place that you could use the ellipses is in the middle when you're skipping words, in the middle of the quote. Here's another thing, guys. When you are narrowing down what quote that you want to incorporate as your text evidence, make sure that you are positively sure about that quote being the strongest possible quote that you could insert. Reason being is you do not want to include a quote that is multiple sentences. There should never be a need to cite more than one sentence. If you come across a really complex sentence, make sure that you are choosing the most relevant points to your argument within that sentence. So if there's extra words in there that you know you don't need, skip them with the ... So those are some tips and suggestions. If I come up with any more, I will let you know, but I think that this is a pretty decent starting point. And remember, you can always go back to this video if you have trouble embedding or blending your quotes. All right, so let's do some practice. Here's our question. How do the dispossessed neighbors feel about losing the land? And we're still talking about the story called The Interlopers by Saki. You're going to support your answer with text evidence. So I have already answered our question. The dispossessed neighbors feel very angry at the loss of the land. Great. Now I need to support this answer with evidence. So step one, unofficial step one, is going to be to find a piece of evidence that's actually going to support this idea that the dispossessed neighbors or the Zanayans feel angry. So I'm going to go to my story. I'm looking at my story, and I'm going to look for the part where it talks about the dispossessed neighbors and maybe some anger or whatever feelings they have towards each other, the Zanayans and the von Gradwitz. So paragraph 2 is what I want to look at, because paragraph 2 talks about the feud and the dispute over the land. I'm going to read through the paragraph, and then I'm going to underline or highlight some potential quotes that may or may not help me prove my answer. So here we go. I'm going to use yellow. All right, the forest lands of Gradwitz were of wide extent and well stocked with game. The narrow strip of precipitous woodland that lay on its outskirts was not remarkable for the game it harbored or the shooting it afforded, but it was the most jealously guarded of all its owner's territorial possessions. A famous lawsuit in the days of his grandfather had wrested it from the illegal possession of a neighboring family of petty landowners. The dispossessed party had never acquiesced, or agreed to, in the judgment of the courts, and a long series of poaching affrays and similar scandals had embittered the relationships between the families for 3 generations. The neighbor feud had grown into a personal one since Ulrich had come to be head of his family. If there was a man in the world whom he detested and wished ill to, it was George Zanayam, the inheritor of the quarrel and the tireless game snatcher and raider of the disputed border forest. The feud might perhaps have died down or been compromised if the personal ill will of the 2 men had not stood in the way. As boys they had thirsted for one another's blood; as men each prayed that misfortune might fall on the other, and this wind-scourged winter night Ulrich had banded together his foresters to watch the dark forest, not in the quest of 4-footed quarry, but to keep a lookout for the prowling thieves whom he suspected of being afoot from across the land boundary. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. There's definitely a lot of evidence in here that would point to there being a lot of anger and bad blood between the 2 families, such as this quote right here. A famous lawsuit in the days of his grandfather had wrested it as in the land. There's that one. And we have a semicolon there, and a semicolon is basically like a fancy period. It separates two independent thoughts. So I'm going to change my colors just so I can distinguish between the two different pieces of evidence. So that could work as another piece of evidence. Let's do another color. Let's do purple. Let's see, is there anything else? In a long series of poaching the phrase and similar scandals. Okay, this part could work as well, because it talks about how the relationships have become embittered, and it's been going on for 3 generations. Oh, there's another one right here with the one with the blood. Oh, I almost said bad blood. I'm going to use red here. The boys, they thirsted for one another's blood, and as men, each pray that misfortune might fall on the other. Okay, so we have 4 potential quotes that we could use to support our answer that the dispossessed neighbors, aka the Zaniams, feel very angry at the loss of the land. But we want to only pick one. We could only pick one. So I think that the one that captures the hatred, the anger the most is probably the one in purple. A long series of poaching affrays and similar scandals had embittered the relationships between the families for 3 generations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a little bigger so I can still see this and this at the same time. And I'm going to continue staying in color code just so it's easier for some of us to see the 3 steps of the quote sandwich. So step 1 was supposed to be in blue. This is where we introduce the quote. And remember, we have to act as though our person, whoever is going to be reading our responses or reading our essays, has no idea what's going on in the story. So the dispossessed neighbors feel very angry at the loss of the land. How can I introduce what's going on in the situation or in the story within this situation before we get to this part? Well, I could lead up to it by talking about what's going on over here. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say, ever since, the courts decided that the land belongs to the von Gradwitz family, and at this point I want to start thinking about at when can I best fit this come on, this purple quote into my response. So let's see, if I were to insert it now, would it make sense? Let's experiment. Ever Ever since the courts decided that the lands belonged to the von Gradwitz family, a long series of poaching affrays and similar scandals had embittered the relationships between the families for 3 generations. Does that flow like a complete sentence? Yeah, it does. So I don't really need to make too many edits there. I'm going to switch my colors to green. And here we go. Oh, that's not very green for you. So I'm just going to write in that quote until I have put in as much information as required, as much information that makes sense. Oops. My bad. It's been a long day today. I feel like I don't really need to mention the families again since we already talked about the dispossessed neighbors in the beginning. So I'm going to use my dot dot dots, my ellipses, and I'm going to jump to the very end. For 3 generations. And my sentence still makes sense. So I'm going to close up my quote, and now I need to cite it, last name of the author, along with the page number. Period on the outside. Step 1 was in the blue, introducing our quote. Step 2 was adding in the quote that's in green. Step 3 is going to be to explain our quote. So when we explain our quote, we don't need this anymore. Take a look at our chart right here. We want to explain why the quote is so important. We need to be able to tie it back to our answer. How does it connect with the answer? What might the quote mean or represent? So these are just some starting points that you might want to think about when you're writing your commentary. You want at least 2 commentaries per quote. So the explanation of a quote must be as long as or longer than the quote itself. This is where our analysis gets done, guys. Do not, and I repeat, do not retell the quote in your own words. That's not what we're looking for here. So let's take a look at our answer down here that we were working on. Why did we choose this quote? What is this quote supposed to show or reveal? This reveals that the Znaim family clearly does not believe that their neighbors rightfully deserve that strip of land. Furthermore, using a transition word right here, the Zanaims are proving to be stubborn and will do whatever they please. Regardless of what society has dictated. So I have 2 very, I don't want to say wordy, but in-depth, 2 in-depth sentences worth of commentary to follow my quote. And as you can see, it is as long as, if not longer, than the quote itself, which is perfect. And sure, this from the blue down to the red or pink might seem like a lot of work, but I promise you, the sooner we get practice in doing this kind of stuff, the easier our essays are going to be, the easier our race responses, which we haven't really talked too much about. Those are going to be. Race is pretty much like this, except there's one additional step that I'm going to have you do that I've already done for you on our practice worksheet. So we'll talk about race a little bit later, but this is the basis for race. This is the basis for our essays. If you find yourself struggling on how to do this, definitely ask for help while you can, because once we start working on extended responses and essays, I may not be able to help you one-on-one as much. So use this video, use the tips that I've gone over here to kind of help you practice how to blend and embed those quotes. Make sure that you keep a copy of this handout safe in your binder somewhere. This will help you a lot. Not only this year, but next year in 161, 162, and beyond. So that was that. If you are here to see how to embed a quote, this is where your video is going to end. But I am going to show you your assignment on Google Classroom, just in case if you forgot. So your assignment is called Practice Blending Quotes on Google Classroom. Those of us who are in person have a paper copy. Remember, you can always zoom in using the insert or using the magnifying glass right underneath the insert option on your toolbar. And you're going to type wherever you see the blue type here button. So the numbered items are the questions, the text-based questions. In the thing following the question, so where it says the letter A, those are your answers. You are not looking to answer my questions. You are looking to support my answers with evidence from the text. So for example, for number 1, in the necklace, does Matilda deserve the punishment she receives? I said, Matilda definitely deserves the punishment she receives for losing her friend's necklace. Now you need to prove to me, why does she deserve to be punished? You're going to look at the story, The Necklace. It's available to you on Canvas. And you want to look for certain parts which make you feel like, oh my gosh, this girl totally needs to get punished. She's so rude. She's so ungrateful. Hint, hint, wink, wink. And that's where you want to start. Isolate your quote first, and then go through your quote sandwich steps. For number 2, we've got, in the necklace, Matilda has grown as a character over the course of, has Matilda grown as a character over the course of the story? The answer, although Matilda matured during the 10 years of hard work, she wasn't completely transformed. So I'm saying, yeah, she did kind of grow, but not really. So you need to support my answer with the but not really part. What makes you, or what makes the person who answered the question decide that she wasn't completely grown or evolved or changed? Number 3, in Lamb to the Slaughter, did Mary Maloney genuinely love her husband? The answer says, although she killed her husband, there's plenty of evidence in the story to support the argument that Mary Maloney actually loved her husband very much. This one's a pretty easy one. Like the whole first page, you could find something about Mary being in love with her husband. So isolate your piece of evidence, blend it, add your quote, explain why you chose that quote, how it relates back to the answer. And you're going to do the same thing for the last 2. 4 and 5 both have to do with the story that we just were talking about, the interlopers. All of you should have physical copies of this, unless you are a hybrid student. Regardless, Copies of all stories have been made available to you on Canvas, and they are located under week 9, day 3. I can show that to you. So I'm on the home page. Here's week 9. If you scroll, day 1, day 2, day 3. Here we go. Here's our quote sandwich paper, and here are our stories. If you have any questions, feel free to Canvas me. My weekend hours are from 10 to 6. And this will be due next week. So best of luck.